All right, so in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the kitchen debate. And so we've kind of, if you watched the other video where I go through the Own Your Own Home campaign, we've already talked through kind of the early 20th century foundation that was laid by that. So the Own Your Own Home campaign really kind of fostered this ideology that connected homeownership with kind of mainstream whiteness, and middle-class American belonging, right? It tied homeownership to patriotism somewhat, but we see that really grow exponentially as we get to the mid-20th century. So I showed you in that other video that clip from the PBS documentary where you see the woman spinning around in her kitchen singing about how it's not just the home she has, right? But she's singing about, I have the stove and I have the refrigerator and I have this appliance and that appliance, right? And as she's perfectly made up in her fancy dress, she really becomes this, symbol of, white middle-class womanhood and of all the great things that come with home ownership. So that ad that you saw in the PBS video is really closely connected to what happens in the kitchen debate. And I picked this for you because it's this really famous and great moment in history where you can very clearly see, kind of the political stakes in homeownership and the ways that it is very much connected to kind of white space and belonging. So let's talk a little bit about the debate itself, and I'm assuming this may be an unfamiliar bit of history to some of you. I had you watch that clip, and then I had you read through the transcript, so you should at least kind of know the conversation that went down. And I wanted you to see the clip because these are such big personalities, but Khrushchev in particular, right? So what happened is, this is during kind of the Cold War, right? In 1959, and if you know anything about 1959, a lot goes down for the Cold War in that year, including the Cuban, Revolution. So, what happens is you have this exchange between then Vice President Richard Nixon, so he's the Vice President at that time, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And so, Cold War tensions were rising, right? But again, it's called the Cold War because there's meant to be this semblance of, diplomacy. So what happened is the US and the USSR agreed to host this kind of cultural exchange, but really it was meant to be kind of a competition of sorts, or that's how it played out, I should say. So what happened is that the USSR had a display in New York in June of 1959 where they were meant to display kind of all of the great things about Soviet society. And then in July, the month after, the U.S. exhibit opened in Moscow. And again, similarly, the U.S. is meant to be displaying all of the things that make America great, right? So I'm going to actually walk you through most of this lecture. I'm going to show you images from the actual expo because it really hits on the way that the U.S., both kind of consciously through these politicians and maybe kind of unconsciously through consumer habits, was constructing itself not just to its own citizens, right, and people living in the borders of the U.S., but also to the outside world. So at this exhibit, I talked a little bit about what happened, and maybe we'll circle back at the end of the video to the big showdown between them. You hear some of it, and then you miss this image of what's happening in this conversation. And this image is what the transcript you read shows. But before we dig into that, let's look at the exhibit itself, right? So I'm going to see if I can make these images a little bigger. I think that should be better for you. So that you can get a sense of what's going on in this exhibit. So you see here, again, this is taking place in Moscow, and this is meant to show, the everyday people of Russia or the USSR at that time, all that America has to offer. So you'll notice, again, a lot of consumer goods here, right? So you have this display of a kitchen and all the gadgets that go in the kitchen, right? So you have kind of your automatic, refrigerators and kettles. You have the nice, new fancy pots and pans, the iron. It's interesting to think, though, about the different ways that in an expo where the U.S. is meant to be kind of showing off how exceptional it is or why it's the better kind of system of capitalism, maybe unsurprisingly, it's all tied to the goods that can be consumed by Americans. Interesting, though, is how many of those goods are tied explicitly to homeownership and to kind of gender dynamics. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to show you in these images. So, and you can find these images online. It was easier for me to do it this way and then put them on slides for you. So a lot of people have compiled them. If this is something that interests you, that you want to kind of look at later. But this is another good example, right? You have this exposition here. And again, look at all of the people who are coming to kind of see what America has to offer. And what America says it has to offer is lots of television sets, right? It's interesting to think not only of what that means in terms of the entertainment industry at that time, but also, again, this idea of, look at the variation here, right? Different sizes, different shapes, different styles, this idea that it's a land of plenty, but that plenty is tied to consumer goods, right? That these are things you can purchase, and they're all home goods, which is very fascinating. Not all of them, but the majority of things that are displayed. So I will show you this in case you're into reading these kinds of things, but it shows a little bit of, we talked in the last video when we looked at the Own Your Own Home campaign and the connections between the private sector and the public sector, how what initially began as a joint effort between the National Real Estate Association or the National Association of or Real Estate Board, I can't remember the acronym offhand, but that group and the construction industry originally started the Own Your Own Home campaign to help, their own kind of economic interest, and it soon merged with these government interests in terms of, promoting an idea of homeownership tied to American patriotism to help stave off the threat of communism. Well, that's only increased, right, in the 40 years since then, right? Since 1919, 40 years between when the government really took over that Own Your Own Home campaign, that conjunction or that kind of, that overlapping interest in home ownership and patriotism has only grown. And so you see the public and private working together, and that all these different television sets and those home goods that you see here, these are different companies who have, given their goods to be put on display, right? And so this lists some of them, but hundreds of companies, from Sears to General Mills to Kodak, are all promoting their goods. But again, it's interesting to think that the idea of America, which that's what's being sold here, right? We're demonstrating or trying to sell to Soviet citizens the idea of America as exceptional and superior is tied to the availability of goods. And that in this case and in this time, those goods are very distinctly tied to kind of the space of the home. So there's some other kind of displays with books, that should be unsurprising. And here you have a demonstration of some of the food and gadgets, right? So, notice you have this woman here demonstrating, and what is she using here? I mean, this is all now very familiar to all of us, but these pre-made mixes and flours and all of these things that are, again, meant to make domestic life easier, right? So she's not only, there's the story about people taking some of the goods and, that being like a sign they really want what the Americans have, but look at the fact that she's just demonstrating to them, here's what you can do with these goods. And I think food is such a universal thing that people can use to it conjures up these good feelings for us. But again, it's tied to this idea of particularly marketed goods in this context, right? So you'll notice the Crisco here. You'll notice the very particular kinds of utensils and things she's using to make it. And then I believe that's a General Mills box, but I have to go and double check, right? Lots of other home goods you can notice here, the fancy crystal, the musical instruments. I'm going to scroll down. This is one I wanted to make sure you had seen because Well, a lot of the things that were on display were very much about home gadgets or food products or things tied to domestic space. Remember that going back to the Own Your Own Home campaign, the domestic space itself, what made it a home versus like the gender kind of formation of men, you remember that image saying he's a patriot, he's a husband, father, is to provide the house. But it was the gender formation created for women to turn it into a home, right? So all these gadgets and goods and mixes and things like that are a part of that. But another example of how America was marketing itself to the USSR was just this image of, fashion and of white American womanhood, right? So you see her dressed up in her fancy kind of fashion forward dress with the very nice earrings on. And again, it's marketing the idea of white American womanhood, of white American domesticity and beauty. This I want you to think about because in that transcript you read, and which I'll kind of come back to towards the end of this lecture video, this is where you get the heated debate between Khrushchev and Nixon, right? It's that they start arguing about the home, but then they end up arguing about gender constructions themselves and the differences between their two nations. So, this should be slightly less surprising in terms of art and patriotism. You see here this image of, the cute little farmhouse, dollhouse here. And I think, it's interesting to think of I didn't spend a lot of time on this, making this a somewhat shorter video for you. But look at the faces of the people who are, kind of consuming the ideology that's being sold here, right? So you see the little girl, and again, this should make you think about the consumers of those Own Your Own Home marketing posters, right? That they were selling an ideal, right? They're selling the idea of not just owning a home, but all the things that were tied to it, right? If you think of the image of the woman who had her hand on the house with her wedding ring on, right? And for this little girl, it's being sold the idea of America is not just a place where you have access to things, but where kind of your dream of what ownership and family life could be would come to fruition. And so that is kind of the fascinating thing about this cultural exchange and the particular way it was marketed through the lens of kind of family. So here's another exhibit, and if you, maybe now it's super kind of popular, people are into the mid-century modern look, but at the time, this was, like the highest, trendiest kind of furniture that you have here. And you see this home set of the library with the books and the desk and the nice, fancy lamp. And it's interesting to think, again, this is a display to say, here is what American culture is. Here is what is so great about capitalism. And the display is of what could be, in a nice new home that's being sold under those FHA housing policies. Here's what someone's home office or, den would look like, right? So it's interesting to think about the way that what was being marketed internally to particularly white citizens at that time is then again being exported to build on this ideology of who we are as a nation. And again, I use that we in the kind of royal we sense, because next week we're going to spend a lot of time digging into, well, who really is that we, and what was being marketed to Black Americans? Were they being sold this dream, these goods? Or, if not, what did it look like for them? Cars are definitely not a surprise. I will say, we'll maybe talk a little bit about this. I guess we can. We're not just talking about home ownership, so I'll slightly talk about this. But you'll notice a contrast in cars that are marketed towards white Americans and Black Americans in this era, building on the kind of ideologies at that time around who Black and white consumers were. And you'll read about this more next week, so it'll make more sense. But, what we'll see next week is, if I give you kind of a preview, is, well, white American identity was being constructed in terms of ownership and these kind of, nice, comfortable domestic spaces. They were also being constructed as financially savvy, right? You're putting equity in something that will last. On the contrast, you have, narratives that are familiar to us now of like, well, all those people living in the city, they don't know how to save their money. They just want flashy cars and expensive goods. Well, where does that come from? And that's really what we're going to look at next week, through targeted marketing. So where you have, certain kinds of cars and things marketed towards white Americans, you have very different kinds of cars and objects marketed towards black Americans. And it's usually, you want the fancy Cadillac to prove that you have worth, or you can only afford these certain domestic models. So that's what's going to be marketed to you. And so it's interesting, again, to contrast these diverging practices along racial lines in the US, and to think about the way that things were being exported to Russia or to the USSR at this time. What's happening in the USSR is that the narrative of kind of American identity as tied to home ownership and having access to all the food and goods and products that make life great, it's a white American narrative, but it's being sold as the universal narrative of the country, right? And that, if you're familiar at all with kind of the politics of that era, becomes a key point of tension. And a lot of the reason why you see some solidarity between the USSR, for example, and a lot of black power groups is because they see the disconnect between, what the US or folks like Nixon were saying, this is what American is, and then you have a lot of black Americans saying, well, that's not America for me, right? So it's interesting, again, just to think of the ways in which what is even American or what's marketed out externally as American is very specifically white. So I won't spend much time on this because these are images from the entire expo, but this is not as relevant to us. I do think it's hilarious to think of people trying out the Pepsi. But again, think about the fact that everything that is tied to American is, again, these marketing of goods, and it's kind of hilarious. So this one makes a little more sense in terms of, marketing medical advancements and things like that. Detroit. I don't think anyone in this class is from Detroit, but it is interesting to think about the role of that as a historically black city producing these goods that are marketed and often consumed and tied particularly to like whiteness and white success and acceptance, both in the nation, and then you can see them awing over the latest things that come out of Detroit. And if you're not familiar, maybe I should back up and say, hopefully you know the history of Detroit as kind of the central place where a lot of vehicles were produced, and it was this booming city for many, many, many decades until, very recently. So I'll skip over the dolls, but again, this is tied to this notion of domesticity and the things available within that space. So I'm going to flip back, and I know these are cool images, and again, you can look at them on your own, but I want to talk just in the last few minutes of this video about the debate itself. So you get a sense, hopefully now, I wanted to give you a picture of the expo. And this is where kind of the heated conversation takes place. Although you saw another clip, I wanted you to hear them in that clip, even though they didn't get into it too much. The clip shows the dynamic between Nixon and Khrushchev. But in this kitchen exhibit is where you get this heated debate, and you read the transcript of it. But I wanted you to see that it's not just this kitchen, right? It's not just this display, but this goes within this wider expo, which is heavily, primarily saying, here's what makes America great. It's our household goods, our kind of white domestic goddesses, and all of these kind of ideals that are tied to middle-class white citizenship, right? That's how capitalism was being defined and marketed to the rest of the world. So in this particular exhibit, what you're seeing here, and I don't know if I can make this bigger. It's a little gritty, so I apologize for that. So this is part of a full-scale model of a $14,000 home, which, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it was I would say a slightly more than average kind of price of the homes that you would see in Levittown, right? So the things you saw and learned about in that PBS video, this is that home, right? You heard him say in that Levittown video, it's not just a home, but it comes with the washer and dryer, the fridge, XYZ. That's what this full-scale model had. So Nixon is walking Khrushchev through everything, and you see him pointing, right? And look at, if you read body language, it's interesting to think of kind of the ease at which he is satisfied with this. Well, she's displaying, look, here's the washer, here's the products you use with the washer. Again, sorry for how grainy this image is, but you can kind of Google it if you want to see some other versions. But so he walks him through the display, and as he's walking through it, they get into this heated argument, right? And you read the transcript where Nixon is arguing and saying, this thing that you're seeing in front of you with all these goods, with all these products, is easy to afford in the U.S., right? And again, it's easy to afford because of the FHA and Hulk and veteran policy changes that made ownership and access to not only the house but these goods possible for the wide majority of white Americans. So Nixon takes that and makes that the kind of crux of his argument against Soviet communism. And then he goes on to point towards all these things as they're walking through. And he's saying, it comes with the new model of this dishwasher and this and that, and it comes with all these goods. And then there's this part where he says to Khrushchev, quote, "In America, we like to make life easier for women," right? Now, this is where it gets heated. And I think that, if you read through the transcript or if you were interested and you Google kind of other exchange, you'll notice that this is where they butt heads, right? So it may seem unfamiliar to you, but at that time, the USSR was far ahead of the US in terms of dominant narratives. Again, not to say everybody there, but dominant narratives of gender, right? So there was much more of a promotion of women being equals than, what you see here. So Nixon and his marketing of the US to Soviet Russia says, we make life easier for our women, and you can see all the ways we do it through all of what makes domestic space great. And think about those images you saw of all the different goods and products and the dress, right? This is all of what Nixon is trying to conjure up in this conversation. Well, Khrushchev rejects that, and he gets angry, and they have this heated debate where, Khrushchev really says, that's what defines America, right? He says that you all have these sexist beliefs, and here in the USSR, we treat women as equals, right? Well, you'd think that might be the end of it, but then Nixon responds and says, this attitude towards women is universal. What we want to do is make life more easy for housewives, right? So that's what he says, and that's his error of more easy instead of easier. So this is what's fascinating about this moment. On one hand, you have these competing ideologies of, which economic system was better. And now, might seem kind of, like this is long past and we've moved on. We haven't, but if anything right now, we're seeing some of the tensions and issues with capitalism very clearly. But back then, again, these were seen as like equally competing forces in the world, right? World powers. And so you have them debating and saying, using the symbolism of, in this case, kind of white womanhood as the example, the point of contention between the difference between, Soviet communism and American capitalism. And so all that comes to define American capitalism for Nixon is making life easier for women, having widely accessible homes and products and goods. But what we're going to talk about next week is, what does this mean, right? If you're familiar at all, even if you've seen horrible movies like The Help, you know that in this era, even with all these goods and products and household things, a lot of these spaces were being taken care of by Black women who were coming in to do domestic work, right? So in a way, Nixon is kind of erasing the reality of what that looks like. It's also not acknowledging everything we've just learned about the majority of Black Americans who are living in these forced kind of highly populated urban areas with limited options in terms of home ownership, being kind of carouseled into the public housing projects, being stripped of, public assistance. And so that narrative, that America, does not come through in this conversation at all. So it's interesting to think in this era of, how we go originally from kind of this question of space in general to talking about homeownership to now talking about the wider idea of, the city versus the suburbs and the domestic home space versus kind of the apartment or the streets, right? And how these spaces begin to define America itself and American identity, and how that's marketed and talked about around the world. And so next week, we're really going to dig into, like, while we're having, well, not we, but while these conversations are being had about who and what America is as a space that is good for middle-class white Americans, that is good for, happy housewives, as Nixon puts it, what is the reality then in outside of these quote-unquote happy domestic spaces? What is the reality for Black Americans? What are they being sold? What are they being told to aspire to, if anything at all? And so next week, we'll spend our time digging into those things. But hopefully this week, between the Own Your Own Home campaign images, between understanding kind of this key debate or conversation during the Cold War between Nixon and Khrushchev, and between the article you read by Lucan and Vaughn, you get a sense of how the stakes of ownership over space become about so much more than just kind of a financial or even a social kind of ownership, right? So it's not just about building your financial equity or living in community with people like you, but it's about the ways in which you fit into the stories of this nation and how it constructs itself, and the ways in which stories are told about you as a person that belongs to or inhabits certain spaces. So this should set you up, hopefully give you a lot to think about, and then next week we'll turn more explicitly to the streets and to Black American consumers and to what was happening to them while all these other dominant narratives are being kind of spun.